Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Today, we're going to be discussing bioregionalism and can it solve the housing crisis? But first, I'll do some proper introductions and then we'll get going. So yeah, a big welcome and hello to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We here at AELA are very excited about our bioregionalism webinar series, where we're generating some wonderful conversations and thought pieces on what our world might look like if we organised ourselves within our lovely natural boundaries or natural systems. So get to that, our definitional and other issues in just a moment. For those who don't know me, my name is Michelle Maloney, and our webinar today is going to be a short introduction from me about what and why bioregionalism is of interest. And then we're going to turn to Elena and Anitra to be putting housing, the current housing crisis, into the context of framing bioregionalism as one of the ways to think about better ways forward. But just a quick advert. Bear with me, thank you. On the 19th of September, got a lovely young researcher who'll be joining us to talk about modern understandings of bioregionalism. So it'll be a little bit of theory, but a lot of case studies on what other people around the world are up to. So please do consider joining us on the 19th of September. And then our final webinar for this year will be in October with the wonderful Ian Lowe, where we're talking about what Western science knows about bioregions, planetary boundaries, and all of the things that Western science can tell us about nature. Next year, we'll be continuing the series and we'll be kicking off early in the year with a number of amazing Indigenous speakers who I'm just lining up now. And for those who missed it but would like to listen to the wonderful webinar we hosted with Shrishti Bajpai from India, that recording is on our events website, on the AELA website, on the events web page. Okay. So that is the quick advertisement for the bioregionalism seminars. I should have acknowledged country first, so I would like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the unceded lands of the Kabi Kabi peoples, and just to the northwest of me are the Jinnabara traditional custodians as well. That beautiful photo is of the Glasshouse Mountains, which play an incredibly important part in the story landscape and the songlines of the Kabi Kabi peoples. I'd like to acknowledge that the lands were never ceded, always was and always will be the lands of the Kabi Kabi people. And I'd like to acknowledge any Indigenous peoples on this call today, and probably give a plug for the fact that together with Future Dreaming, AELA is trying to contribute in a strong way to helping people understand decolonisation and all the different aspects of that. And we're actually hosting a short 4-week course in October about that, so I might pop the information in the Zoom chat for you. So for those who don't know where Kabi Kabi country is, it's just north of Brisbane and on the Aboriginal map of Australia, there we are. So a big hello from here. And it's become quite a lovely tradition if you did want to type into the Zoom whose land you're on, where you are today, perhaps what the weather's like, because weather across this beautiful continent is a bit wild and wacky at the moment. We were just talking about that. We're as hot as Hades up here in Queensland and our guest speakers have scarves on, so bring on spring. All right. Why is AELA interested in bioregionalism? The Australian Earth Laws Alliance, or AELA, as we love to call her, is all about working to increase the understanding and practical implementation of Earth-centred everything. But we use a framing around governance. Basically, we ask, how can we make positive change to our current governance systems to create ecologically healthy and socially just communities of humans and others? What do we mean by governance? It's actually really important to us that we explain this because it sounds like a word that can mean everything and nothing. If you Google governance, you actually do get many thousands of definitions, but we keep it pretty simple. We're interested in the rules that we make as human beings to live, work and play together at every scale, from the tuck shop through to the corporation, through to our federal government, through to local councils. How is it that we organise ourselves and manifest activities and treat nature and each other in certain ways? And much of this is built on the activities we do, which are at the tip of the iceberg. Further down, thinking about where those ideas come from as to how we organise and what's fair and good. Our laws, moral codes and social norms enforce and often create the kinds of governance systems we set up. But underneath all of that are our culture and our values and our beliefs. And so from the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, or AELA's perspective, we've been working for 10 years to hopefully increase knowledge around Australia and connect it to international communities about alternatives to the current dominant economic and legal systems that place some human beings above others and most human beings above nature. Why is bioregionalism of interest to us? Well, when you look at the rules that we make to interact with each other, to interact with nature across a society, typically the map of Australia has these big straight lines created by the British Empire when it was carving up the continent. Bioregionalism is different. It doesn't see politics as just a human-created issue. And I'll read the definition here, it's a philosophy that sees human societies and culture as part of nature and proposes that modern human societies could be more sustainable, successful, and meaningful if our political, cultural, and economic systems are organised and nurture our natural boundaries and our natural systems. Some have referred to bioregionalism as localisation within the foundations of nature, which is really quite a lovely way to explain it. AELA is interested because at the end of the day, if the kind of systems change we're looking at to reduce the harm we continue to create for ourselves and for the rest of the living world, we need to rethink everything that we do. It's not a small ask, is it? But one of the reasons bioregionalism, connecting to our local places and actually understanding how do we build human lives in these places that could live here forever, that's the key question. How do we become inherently capable of living in a place forever? It means to look after it, to understand it, to deepen our connection with the place. And in Australia, the good thing about bioregionalism is it can be a bridge between different cultural takes on governance. First Nations governance systems, as many would know, were fundamentally built on what we would call a bioregional approach, which is dreaming stories helped communities understand their boundaries, their living world, and their job was to maintain life and culture and joy in the local places. And that Aboriginal map of Australia, and Mary Graham and other people who talk about Indigenous governance, it's very much built out from the living world and built into the place, which is wonderful. And the other thing is bioregionalism really does connect with localising governance, citizen initiatives and localising economies. All of these things are sort of systemic and integrated ways of hopefully building a better way forward. So the questions that AELA asks in our work is where we are, how can we live here forever? At the moment, the story of Australia is colonial legacy of eating up the place, cutting things down, wrecking soils, using up lots of things. So the question is, and the question that many Indigenous societies answered in some way or another, how do we live here forever with a thriving environment and thriving societies? And the other question we ask inside AELA, which drives a lot of people crazy, is if everybody woke up tomorrow in 100% agreement that we should live within our ecological limits, how would we do it? Given our Western culture for 500 years has really been European colonies expanding and extracting from new and different places around the world, to the extent that we now see people eyeing off the moon and asteroids and Mars because we must expand, we must take more. So we don't have a culture that's used to living within limits. We don't have rules, guidance, governance systems that help us nurture and live within a place forever. We're used to moving on and getting more. So that's why the work we're involved in, including the Greenprints program, focuses on these kinds of questions. I won't spend any more time talking about our work, but for us, bioregionalism is a really wonderful way to almost force people to think in an integrated way, looking across systems, everything from human habitats to how we extract and how we use and how we manage waste, right through to how do we deepen our connection with our beautiful living world. So that's why we're interested in it. I'm aiming to turn our webinar series into a handbook on bioregionalism for Australia. That will be happening next year if all goes well. So if you're interested in these issues, please stay in touch with the webinars, but also shoot us a note if you're working on things that you'd love to share with others. We're always excited to hear about great things going on in our beautiful continent and beyond. Okay, so that is my very broad, wandering, rambling introduction. But now I'm really delighted because we're going to go to Elena for 10 or 15 minutes and then to Anitra for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A. If you do have any questions as we go, please just write them in the chat, and we'll save them up and manage that for you in the Q&A section. So over to you, Elena. Thank you for joining us from apparently cooler and windier Melbourne. I think you're on mute, Elena.
Yeah, I can only do one thing at a time. So
well done then. You've done them all.
I focused on screen sharing first. So hopefully you can see that.
Yes, it looks great. Thanks, Elena.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having a chat with me and prompting this conversation. I find all of these issues really interesting and compelling. And just see if I can, how do I do my slides? Okay, yeah, cool. And yeah, I apologize in advance. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is coming out of my half-baked PhD, so we'll just have to do our best, and it might be a bit more of a framing, but I hope to get maybe more value out of the conversation bit at the end. So yeah, I'd also just like to acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri country and that sovereignty was never ceded, and the ongoing connection to country, community, kin, but also recognition of the sophisticated governance processes and stewardship that is involved in Indigenous cultures and communities, and that we would do well to learn as much as we can from all of those systems. My background's in architecture, so that's the kind of lens that I bring to the conversation, and I'm very interested in the role that housing plays in shaping social relationality and by extension connection to the natural world as well, and also our connection to economics and by extension politics. And I feel that housing is no longer a product of resident need or architectural ideas or social good, and it's become a financial asset. And that it's the economics of housing that drives production, use, and accumulation, and it's all heading in a very unhealthy direction. And I'm interested in how housing can help create better forms of relationality across many different systems. And I feel like we've created a bit of a monster out of the housing system. The housing paradigm is based on an individualist approach through ownership, responsibility, and isolation. And en masse, it is creating very antisocial spaces in between the housing that we create. And our perception of value has become narrowed to wealth creation, and so has the city. So somewhere along the line, it's been monopolized by the relationship between money and production rather than social value. And the urban and suburban environments and life have become a mirror of these ideas, and that is extending to shape our social relationships. And it's pretty bad. We live in enormous debt, time poverty. We're expected to do it all alone. And if we fail, then we're considered a social liability. We often don't know our neighbours because we have spaces like these that don't allow us to connect. And we're geographically isolated from our support networks. So I guess that's the first kind of lens of bioregionalism, but also kind of society and environment being all one and the same thing to me, that we've become fractured from the natural systems and social systems, and I think that they're part and parcel of one another, and that there's a significant connection I feel between what we build and also our social and administrative processes. And I'm interested in exploring how housing and urban design would differ if we treated housing as a social and relational infrastructure. And if we created housing differently, then how would that influence governance and political participation? And I suggest that it would foster a bioregional approach. And there's many urban initiatives vying to remedy all the problems that we find in the city and urban and suburban environments. And they include things like the smart city, 20-minute city, just city, green city, city as commons. But many of these innovations are still acting in silos, and they're focused on transport or economics or urban design or governance, and they don't create a holistic approach. And I think housing is a very powerful instrument in reconceptualizing a lot of these systems simultaneously, because it's a significant component of economic activity and debt. It takes up a lot of geographic space. Everyone needs somewhere to sleep and cook and wash. And when it's produced at scale, it informs our access to other things, including amenities, income, each other, and nature. And so my PhD has been looking at the emergence of the commons and Elena Ostrom's work, but then also looking at that through the lens of architecture and design. And so, yeah, commons is a resource that's of mutual benefit and can be sustainably managed through collective governance. And the architects that I looked at were a group called Team 10, who were interested in questioning the modernist paradigm in the middle of last century. But I think a lot of the ideas that were coming through there are very relevant for today. So there are 10 key themes that I have drawn out of the work of the Commons and Team 10 to look at from the perspective of the urban commons and as a social spatial idea. So the first one is called twin phenomena, and it's a social spatial perspective that they were discovering through modernism, where everything was becoming too large or too small, too near and too far, or too much or too little. And Team 10 wanted to see more nuance and harmonization via human and humane scale outcomes. And I feel this dynamic's mirrored in the commons discourse, where the dominant narrative was that a resource can only be sustainably managed by the state or through the market, which is very binary thinking. And that's the same that manifested in housing. There's either kind of market housing or the state, which is essentially consumerism or welfare. But Ostrom revolutionized commons discourse by demonstrating that a commons could be sustainably managed through the efforts of a user collective, and thus disrupting the market state binary. So I'm interested in how we bring that into housing from a kind of ownership and occupation perspective now in contemporary terms. Team 10 were also concerned about the inhumane scale of mainstream modernism, and modernist planning and design and development were all co-evolving with the industrial and capitalist revolutions, and architects were complicit in those outcomes. And a lot of those ideas carry on to today in how we develop planning schemes and obviously the financialisation of the system. And so these architects were criticising the ego of architects and institutional clients and advocating for a more user design, by us, for us approach, which is coming through today in more discourse around co-design and those participatory processes. So there was discourse at the time about rights to the city and the just city, and they've become important ideas that have helped inform the emergence of the urban commons. And since Ostrom's work, the idea of the commons has expanded into many different fields, including the urban commons, which is often framed though through the lens of social geography law, policy, and often in the context of public space rather than private space. So there's still that binary between those two elements. And Team 10 were interested in enhancing the relationship between people and natural phenomenon as a way to ground people in place, but also as a foundation for their identity and agency, which they then considered as a basis for human association. And we've become so fractured from the natural world. And as we were discussing earlier, the weather is very discombobulating. I think everyone is feeling that sense that the systems are broken, and unless you can develop a kind of strong, grounded relationship with something that should feel much more have much more clarity and feel more stable, because natural systems are such long systems and we're here for such a short time. We shouldn't feel this level of kind of craziness, I guess. And so then without that, we then find that flows through into our human connections as well. And I would argue that connection to nature and to each other is essential for relocalization and bioregionalism as well. And so that's where we get to the space between buildings, which is a key lubricant for social connection and obviously connection to nature. And that informs patterns of human behavior and therefore culture. And these ideas coalesce in the urban commons when shared infrastructure becomes a crucial cultural artifact and a wayfinding device. That is, they function as an essential tool for embedding new social norms and patterns towards evolving a collective vision. Therefore, the culture we imbue into the spaces between our buildings shapes our relationship to the natural environment and to each other. And then how we govern these spaces, formally, informally, or collectively, shapes our perception of governance, cooperation, and society. And so the next two themes are enduring cooperation and real democracy. Team 10 considered that new architecture is necessary to represent the aesthetic of great number, which is obviously what they thought was not happening in the mainstream modernist discourse, and certainly hasn't happened as populations have grown exponentially and we have these myriad crises. And I would say that, building off the idea of total life, that this isn't limited to human populations and that society is also not limited to humans either. To me, the aesthetic of great number includes ecological systems and bioregional thinking, and that we need to create a coherence between the humane scale and these dynamic systems in a way that embodies and promotes the social, intellectual, and emotional intelligences of our communities. And so the final theme is around flexibility and adaptability, which will be essential, and I feel a better framing than things like resilience. And we need to quiet our cleverness and manage our egos and be of service. And Team 10 considered that the increase in bureaucracy and simultaneous contracting of the role from their perspective of architects presented key barriers for civic participation, compromised urban innovation, and failed to support the evolving cultural objectives of human populations. Because I think what we've created now is definitely not the system that helps us to thrive and to flourish. And so they considered that the development of better urban outcomes was predicated on more collaborative approaches and less fear-based processes of control and proceduralism. So we need new approaches that foster relational capability. And housing is currently used as a commodity to fill with commodities and an artifact of consumerism and atomization. And so the cost of housing has become the problem of the individual to solve, as I was just talking about earlier, But the social spatial design of housing also means that everything else after that also becomes an issue of the individual person or household. And this framing and form fractures society. And I think that reframing housing as an urban commons and as a commons nested in its bioregional context is therefore not just about the financialisation and ownership of housing, but also processes of design, the spaces between us, and the experiences of living more interdependent lives. That's it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. My button was being difficult. Thank you so much, Elena. Some wonderful concepts and provocations in there. What we'll do is we'll go to Anitra now, and then we'll open up for a really terrific conversation. I have some questions for you, and I'm sure we'll have some other questions when we get ready to chat. So thank you again. And Anitra, over to you.
So can you see that properly?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so it's great to be here with everyone today. I'm speaking from Jara country of the Djarawang peoples, where I live, work and socialise. My take on bioregionalism emphasises, as Indigenous peoples do, the ecological aspects of the specific landscapes we inhabit, the contexts which set unique compasses for our residents in each of them. So I'm going to speak to some of my housing experiences which resonate with bioregional approaches in the hope of giving the term a meaning in practice. During the 1990s, I lived in 2 eco-collaborative housing communities embedded in their landscapes. I remain a patron of the peri-urban Round the Bend Conservation Cooperative within the Bend of Islands Environmental Living Zone, which is on the peri-urban edge of Melbourne in Christmas Hills within the Shire of Nillumbik. Round the Bend Conservation Cooperative is like co-housing, but the 24 dwellings aren't attached. Still, the houses are sited for minimum ecological footprints along 3 ridges on their 132 hectares of land that the community conserves in a variety of ways. It started over 50 years ago, and when I compare the box ironbark forest there with the same kind of forest where I live now, I notice a massive difference as a result of Round the Bend community's regenerative practices. It's rich, it's diverse, there are lots of sounds and smells in that landscape. Now, the Round the Bend Round the Bend community has rules around dwellings that people build. They have limits to gardening, pets aren't allowed, and residents are required to leave fallen trees and branches as habitat. There aren't any fences and so on. Their practices are in tune with the needs of a box ironbark forest. Such intentional communities are not introspective and self-interested as if they were gated communities. They're interactively embedded in their local areas and they network widely. With land for wildlife status, Round the Bend forms part of a remnant bush block corridor, a wildlife corridor link between Kinglake National Park and Warrandyte State Park. Through this involvement, I'm an honorary member of the Territories of Life, ICCA Consortium, and the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. So my understanding of bioregionalism is very akin to that presented earlier in this series in a webinar with Shrishti Bajpai, who is a key team member of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. In my current rural bioregion in central Victoria, specifically the Shire of Mount Alexander, where I live in Castlemaine, we have distinctive options for eco-sustainable housing. An umbrella organisation, the My Home Network, has different working groups, self-organised by those whose interests they represent, including the homeless and the precariously housed. One working group promotes tiny housing, and it has resulted in changes to our local government laws and their application. Tiny houses are useful in rural areas due to their potential for relatively small footprints and housing people affordably. There's also a tenants' rights working group, which has launched a home share scheme where an independent coordinator assists older homeowners typically to house, say, a student, not for money, but rather for household support. The Tenants' Right Working Group explores using spaces above town shops for rental apartments too. So these three examples of tiny houses and different forms of housing tenancy all show ways of making rural areas more efficient in terms of their density, the space housing takes up, economising on service provision and on landscape use. The My Home Network promotes sustainability upgrade schemes for social housing and low-income housing, which means that our community will in the future rely less on carbon-emitting heating and unsustainably sourced materials for their homes, as well as economising on water use and using sustainable sources of electricity rather than unhealthy gas appliances and so on. A renewable energy group in the Shire Township of Newstead partners with an energy retailer to establish a small-scale solar farm to feed electricity into the grid and then into Newstead's homes and businesses. And this has just begun, this project, in an effort to cut carbon emissions. Now, also, among eco-collaborative co-living models in our Shire is Murnau. It's a community of 6 households co-owning land. They share an orchard, they process their erstwhile waste, their water supply and treatments all together. They have a dam together and they offer emergency low-cost housing on their site as well. In North Castlemaine is the Older Women in Co-Housing project, known as WINK. Last year, around 35 women aged over 40 purchased 5 acres of land for which they have designed a village of almost 30 units with the common house, workshop, gardens, and regenerating a neglected creek. Their values focus on sustainability, accessibility, privacy and collective interaction, and they have places for visitors to stay. One of the most important aspects, I think, of WINK is that they have a strong social housing component. Now, the Open Field co-living homestead is in the south of Malden, and it's both a home for 16 residents and a community centre for natural building, regenerative agriculture, and communal living. So these kinds of community-based initiatives show bioregionalism in practice, people housing themselves with attention to the needs and limits of nature, avoiding land clearing, cutting carbon emissions, living in connected and sharing ways, and regenerating landscapes. I think, as Elena emphasised, one of the most important aspects of bioregional approaches is that they're deeply relational rather than transactional in nature. And so I think I'll just leave that there, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Anitra. Wow, so many amazing things to think about and talk about. While everyone starts having a think about questions they may have for you, can we maybe start with, and I hate doing the silo thing, but let's talk about the financial drivers for really inappropriate housing that we're seeing in Australia right now. The topic or the question for this webinar was, can bioregionalism solve our housing crisis? So let's talk about the money first, because, and to inspire us all, I will bring up, no, not that, oh dear, My master plan did not work. There we go. So this is a current reality in many suburbs, certainly north of where I live. And you see the big signs coming up with Lend-Lease and all the other big developers. And I know that wonderful activists, housing advocacy groups, caring politicians, many people have worked for many years to try to make developments very different to this for so many reasons. I mean, Elena, you touched on some of these issues, feeling isolated, certainly having a full financial responsibilities as a small nuclear home. But from an environmental point of view, you know, these are just a devastation of country. I've seen places, you know, completely cleared and then dug up like a moonscape to put in the sewage and everything else. So it is quite nightmarish. But, you know, we apply compassion. People need somewhere to live. Can you comment a little bit about, there's so many wonderful examples. There's so many other ways to do things. How do we combine these beautiful ideas with the kind of breaking down this terrible control of our housing system that big developers and I guess relevant government officials have? Or am I asking the wrong question?
Well, I mean, you can start by the relationship between groups like the Property Council and governments, and that they're very compromised in, or potentially closed-minded in, the things that they are hearing about as the solution. Obviously, we have got a crisis now, which many people could have seen coming from many decades ago, based on the fact that there were many incentives for people to invest in property and you know, to make it what it is today, which can't help but create inequalities in access. But whether they're, you know, they're open to changing planning schemes and the way that things are financed is not just driven by the votes, but also driven by the lobbyists. And until people start to vote differently and very compellingly, they will continue to get away with it. And part of changing the way people vote on issues like this then comes down to the social and cultural elements. And to me, I mean, a lot of people have just tried to do what they thought was the right thing. I mean, people were told to buy their house and buy an investment property and be self-funded retirees, and that was for the good of the country, because then they wouldn't be reliant on the pension and all of those sorts of things. So a lot of people didn't go into it thinking, well, I'm just a little capitalist and I'm going to create my property portfolio. Like, actually, most people are just really good trying to get by, but they didn't look into it with a 10, 20, 30-year macroeconomic perspective and go, actually, what will this do for affordability for my children, grandchildren? But now we do have this situation. It's actually up to all of us to try and address it and to say, well, then we need a critical mass of people voting very differently for very different policies. I'd say the other big issue is that the banks and the lending infrastructure is really what has taken over housing, and it's one of the drivers for the reason development is the way it is that we couldn't, you know, it got to the point where we couldn't just keep expanding from that colonial perspective. So we had to make money in a different way, and that was by colonizing people's lives and livelihoods into ever increasing amounts of debt. And so by getting all of that lending infrastructure to change and to see, not to see these other ideas as incredibly risky, is also hard, because they love the cookie cutter status quo.
Thanks, Elena. Very excellent. Anitra.
Yes, well, the problem is that developers just have so much power, and really they're creating housing as commodities, and so they approach that like any factory owner would. As Elena has suggested, also, like, banks make a lot of money. There's a money that is lended out as mortgages as one of the most stable forms of lending that banks can do. But it does tie up people. They become compliant for the next 30 years, just, in a sense, under the pressure of paying back for their shelter. And this is a really big problem just in terms of us addressing climate change and all of these other issues, is that, people become part of a system. They own a home. They see themselves as having a stake in the market. I think that it was interesting. I heard on the ABC this morning about promoting social housing in Victoria, because we're the state with the biggest amount of problems in terms of homelessness and requiring more housing, and we have the smallest percentage of social housing of all the states and territories. Whereas, for instance, I've visited and stayed in Zurich, where for over 100 years, the city council has actually facilitated cooperatives of residents to come together and take part in establishing their own vertical as well as horizontal housing, massive cooperatives, sometimes of thousands of people. So, once they've done one project, they can actually use that knowledge to establish more vertical buildings with hundreds of dwellings that have got massive kinds of economies, as well as giving people more control over their housing, because they're involved in the design of it. People within those housing cooperatives can just advertise if they need a bigger dwelling or a smaller dwelling. Someone who's leaving the cooperative or wants a swap or whatever, all of these things are negotiated, and that costs, in a sense, nothing. So I think that these are kinds of the eco-collaborative housing and the co-housing are really important ways that people can feel about empowering themselves to actually change the situation that we're in.
Thanks, Anitra. And I'm wondering if that example you've suggested from Zurich raises one of the, I guess, the bottlenecks in the decision-making processes in Australia, which is the state government and planning laws. Can either of you talk a bit about what powers could local councils, what do they have to be more creative in what local communities are inflicted with in terms of large-scale residential and other developments, versus the sort of the whole local council versus state government around the legal power around housing and development? Did you want to speak to that? Because it does seem to me that a lot of the great examples people share are where local groups have a greater say over what they're doing, and where folks have their own means to buy land and create an eco-village, good things happen. But as soon as it moves away from the capacity to do shared ownership privately or individual private ownership where they come together, when it's left to the governments to make different decisions for planning laws, there seems to be a massive gap where good things could happen. Did you want to speak to any of that?
There's shared power between local government and state government from a planning perspective. There's bits in both camps, but the biggest problem is that local governments don't have enough money to do the kind of work that they need to, and that is kind of, more closely linked to a bioregional perspective or potential. And so there needs to be a lot more money then coming down from the state and national bodies in order to fund those adequately. Some of the things could be changed and be different at the state level. For example, state planning schemes should have eco-villages, co-housing, cooperatives as land use terms, but they don't. They fall into other things, and I mean tiny house villages and all of those sorts of things. They come in under just normal apartments or caravan parks or retirement villages, and so none of those quite work. So that's one key thing that needs to change from a state perspective. And then I would say there needs to be a lot more funding put down into the local level so that there is that capacity to develop those participatory conversations between the people and the governance instruments.
Thanks, Elena. Anitra?
Yeah, that's right. Planning and financing and legal areas all collude in a sense to facilitate developer-led housing provision. And so we don't have sufficient laws and financing as well as planning for people to self-build, say self-build collectively, and also for people to have a greater contribution to the planning in their local areas. In Victoria here, there's been a call for councils to improve their consultation, but it's still at the very low level of actually basically just informing people of what their options might be under the current conditions. Nothing like people dreaming up what they want their local neighbourhoods to look like in 20 years' time, and then all collectively putting their efforts into making that happen.
That actually links to, we've got a couple of comments and there's a couple of questions, and we will come back to community land trusts. Thanks. There's a couple of folks popping questions in there. Let's talk about them, because my understanding is they're a pretty amazing way to pull land out of the market and make it what it really is, a solid base for human and other life forms to live somewhere and to do the best we can without constantly having the to and fro of market-based pressure. But we'll come back to that. I was just going to ask, before we go into these questions, which I was waiting to see them come through, from your point of view, both of you, I mean, you know a lot about the housing issues, and I know other issues interconnected too. For ordinary folks who are interested in contributing to shifting the system, obviously everyone wants to try to make things better. What are some of the things you would suggest that they do? We've got questions at the moment going, are groups like AELA lobbying governments? No, we don't, because we're too small. We literally don't have capacity. I played a role in helping to build the new economy network so that more and more people could find each other and start to, join up their ideas. So linked to that question, what can people do? This is an issue that it just feels so big, how people make that change or contribute. Just some thoughts from you guys? Anitra, would you like to go first to take the pressure out of it?
I mean, I worked for many years for the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, which is actually funded by all of the states and federal government to do research in all of the kinds of questions that we've been asking. But we always found it, I found it really difficult and quite frustrating and left in the end just because we were constantly being asked to do research on very similar questions and would come up with answers like, we need more social housing, and there'd be less social housing. So we do have a very dominant kind of system that we work under, but Ahuri has a website, and all of the research that the people who work for the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute have got all their reports and everything up there. And there are really good constructive recommendations. And I think that my home network that we have here in Castlemaine, which is an umbrella organisation and community-led, is a really good model for other communities to have. And if many communities around Australia had these kinds of umbrella organisations of communities, I think we could network and get a set of demands, which would be a little bit like a manifesto, but which could really move parties along. I think the Greens Party seems to have taken up on quite a lot of issues that are important, but this is where I just actually think it's mobilising all the way round.
Yeah, thank you, Anitra. Elena.
Yeah, I mean, I would say join Co-Housing Australia, number one. And then I would also say that I agree we need to have more of a networked approach with the various community land trust organisations, Co-Housing Australia, Degrowth Network, any AELA, everybody around housing specifically, in order to have a consolidated position, because the government is very good at kind of, divide and conquer kind of approach. And so we need to be cohesive, I guess, and strategic in that sense. And then, yeah, I would also say there's, I think, local government elections in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria coming up this year. So go and investigate the candidates and promote the ones that you think are going to do the right thing, and interrogate your own housing and the local government plans, and ask why they can't do better. But I would say also, I mean, I saw a post, I think just this morning, and I haven't looked into it in any detail, from the new federal housing minister, saying that basically they're going to not be doing as much as they wanted to because their housing policies are getting shut down by the Liberal Party and the Greens. And so they're going to devolve more of the action and activity to the states. Now, I mean, we need to take a bioregional approach, which is obviously going down to the local level, but at the same time, that feels like a massive cop-out. What's the point? I was excited when they finally had a minister for housing, and now they've had a change of ministers, and she's instantly announced that, I don't know, they're kind of, stepping away from that responsibility. I would first find out more, because I'm just talking about a tweet that I saw or something. But then call the government and say, no way, because the money isn't at the local level, it comes to, and the states don't have enough either. So we have to have pressure on the federal government to commit to a housing strategy at a national level, because once you start to separate it, then we don't know where are the pockets where the money should be spent, but it has to come from the top. So go get them.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to go through some of the questions and comments now, and we will definitely have a bit of a yarn about community land trusts. So I'm seeing a couple of questions coming through in the general public list and also in the private one. First, I'd like to share a note from Lynette. She's saying that the Housing Older Women movement has got a big project in September. There are seminars in 4 areas of Southeast Queensland to seed working groups for perpetually affordable, citizen-led, intergenerational housing. She's put the web link in there. I'll try in a moment when the others are chatting to copy that and pop it back in again. So it's in Humanities, My Home, Your Home, Our Homes, projects and seminars. Thanks for sharing that, Lynette. And I really, actually, while I keep moving through, I should mention, as Eleanor was saying, we do need a network to strengthen connections between existing housing groups. I think the New Economy Network Australia, NENA, needs to resurrect its housing and human habitats hub So that can at least start a way to do that. So how about I commit to brushing off the old email list and seeing who might like to come together, even if we just make it easy for people to have 5 things to go and harass politicians about. I think that would be really helpful. Thanks for some of your comments. I won't have time to read them all through. Jenny says that we don't have a housing shortage, we have a roof sharing crisis. That's one way to describe it. JP's made a statement, but I think it is an interesting comment, so I might read this one for you, Elena and Anitra, to respond to. Coming from another country, considering the house and land package model here in Australia, which is apparently best for investment model for purposes, it seems to be shocking and destructive, and that plus the general ruthlessness of the rental markets is socially destabilising. I wonder, particularly Anitra, the Australian way of doing real estate, a lot of us don't know any other systems. Did you want to comment on this housing and land package thing, or any other aspect of the Australian model in particular?
It's to some extent close to the American one. It's a general capitalist kind of model. I think that the developers have too much the ear of politicians. And we've just seen all of this CMFW, EW kind of the union problem. That's all in construction. There are really powerful forces there, and sometimes they're malevolent. So, I mean, I support unions and unionisation, in terms of being community-led, but as it so happens, I actually just think that developers are one of the biggest power holders in terms of industries, and that's really quite destructive. And yeah, we do actually need to replace that with more proper community demands.
Thanks, Anitra. And look, I know on every single topic there's so much we can talk about. Today we're really just finding those connections between the many flaws in our housing system, and how connecting it to localization and to nature might make things better. And I think we know that, but how to get to that is the really tricky stuff. Kevin has made a comment, which I'd love your thoughts on, guys. In 1980, 70% of housing loans were with credit unions and mutual societies. In 2024, 70% of housing loans are with the big 4 banks. There's a causal relationship between the two. We've touched on that finance issue, but if those stats are correct, and I trust Kevin Cox, I'm sure they are, what do you think about that? Increasing marketisation, is that what that's reflecting, or is it just the fact that a lot of our credit unions and mutual societies are being demolished due to difficult regulatory environments?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. They got absorbed by the big banks, or they disappeared. I mean, we need to bring them back, basically, but even doing work in the cooperative housing space and talking to the co-op banking and mutual banking sector, even they are very nervous and risk averse around funding co-ops. They are a co-op. They're scared of funding co-ops, even though co-ops are, much more stable as an investment, typically, than ordinary company or activity. So there's no reason. But one of the key things that they said is that when banks are lending to the developers, then there's not people associated with it. I mean, people are buying off the plan, but it's more de-identified, I suppose. And one of the things that the co-op bank people I talked to said was, well, we don't want a picture on the front of the newspaper with a whole bunch of sad people because their co-op housing project fell over. And to me, that is incredibly disappointing, because what we see instead is a whole bunch of people, I mean, most of the country in a housing crisis, and it's, but it's not on the front page of the newspaper, and enough, and that actually, these lending institutions have a responsibility. If we're talking about a social relational approach, we can't just be looking at it as Anitra was saying, from this kind of economic exchange perspective, we have to, I mean, we have to look at it from as a society, from a society and civilization. I mean, who is it? Our friend, the economist from the Australia Institute, it's like, I'll pay more I'd rather have more tax in a society and more civilization than less tax and no civilization.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I would comment that it comes back to the economy, doesn't it? This idea that we've all been challenging for many decades, that we live in a society, not an economy. The economy should be restructured to support the lovely human beings who live within it. Gabrielle has made sort of a longer comment, which I'll just shorten, but they have said reinvigorating civic responsibility is important, requires a shift towards greater citizen engagement in local governance processes. And I think we'd all agree to that. Interestingly, at the beginning of your comment, you mentioned that we have relinquished a significant amount of power for the sake of convenience, with local councils and governments actively discouraging citizen involvement. As a lawyer who's pretty good on the history of the governance of this nation, I would suggest that civic participation has never been a priority in the Australian legal system. Set up by the British Empire in the first instance, with colonies with total control from the British Empire itself, and then independent colonies becoming combined as a federation. Local councils are just a creation of the state governments. They're just a creation of the state governments. The state governments can effectively do whatever they want with them. They're not enshrined in the Constitution, and there's very little evidence of a commitment, either through a Bill of Rights or any modern human rights acts in Australia, to genuine civic participation in much of anything, actually. And that's why so many citizens feel they're constantly pushing for the right to be heard, for the opportunity to be involved in decision-making. And I'm sure Anitra could comment on this much more than me, but I do know there are other places in the world where they not only allow for greater civic involvement, they're built upon greater ongoing conversations and decision-making. And there's lots of different governance nerdy things that I'm fascinated with, that constantly reaching out to communities to get their opinions on things, to get their thoughts on things. You know, our entire democratic system is very limited. It's representative democracy. We vote, and then we're meant to sit back, shut up, and let the person we voted for battle it out in a parliament or a state or a council area. So I think the roots of our governance system have never been designed to make it easier for people to have influence, and that's what interests me, the bottom-up work we all have to do. And I think Anitra and Elena have spoken to that, the whole joining up the networks of amazing people who have some great solutions, and then pushing into the governance and the laws and the rules that seem to be forced upon us. So that little rant by me is just a way of saying it's not easy. We have to work together within civil society, don't we? Anitra, thoughts?
Yeah, it's just kind of like, to go back to that Swiss example. Of course, you know, they're renowned. They have referendums, and that means
Yes.
every single person, you know, in the city of Zurich voted some years ago that 30% of their housing needed to be cooperative housing of the kind that I mentioned. And it's amazing housing. It's very sustainable. It's kind of like state-of-the-art architect designed housing. And how wonderful that they have that opportunity to actually set these kinds of policies, so that their council are more administrators and executors of their decision making than anything else.
And again, as the governance nerd in the room, or maybe we all are, I don't want to speak for you, but the thing that I love is the fact that they have a process inside their city's governance to reach out and ask people for their opinion, number one. And number two, they actually listen. And so that's not even, you know, just a general motherhoody statement. They've got that embedded in their system. And look, I've worked in and out of different modes of government over the years, and there are many attitudes in government that they're terrified of making mistakes. A good bureaucrat wants to do good work. They're terrified of making mistakes. They're rarely allowed to go out and talk to people about much of anything. They develop policies in a process of odd consultation. So, in fact, policy making would be heavily improved if there were much more lucid and free ways to connect to community opinion. So for me, again, it keeps coming back to this bottleneck of money, money, money in the Australian system, with developers having a big say over governments and local communities constantly being on the back foot to push forward into space and time and ideas. So keeping that in mind, guys and girls, as we all want to do good deeds, we're going to have to play well with each other and other networks, I think. Cheryl's asked a good question.
I was going to add to that,
Oh,
Michelle,
yes, please, Elena.
around,
Yeah.
it's comes back as well to what I was talking about in some of those slides around the ego and the complex of the expert, you know, and that these people have done, you know, degrees and things in planning and all kinds of stuff. And so there's that's part of it, that they're the expert. We still have that model in a lot of many elements of our lives. And then also that perspective about kind of risk exists as well for them, from the perspective of wanting to do the right thing and being afraid to, you know, open the can of worms of community. A lot of I find the culture in local government and the relationship with the communities, that it often feels like they feel like the community is either annoying or idiots. So I think we need to break that down a little bit as well, and have a real kind of cultural reckoning in that space. And then I would also say that part of the economic system and the political system has been to get workers working and consumers consuming, and people do not have time to engage. Like, it's a privileged position to be able to engage in these, you know, extracurricular activities of annoying your local government. I mean, I do it for fun. It's one of my hobbies. I have a filing cabinet, I'm sure. But it's it comes at great cost, and it also comes at great emotional cost, because you find that you don't get very far very often. And people
and again, no, thank you, Eleanor. It really is. It shouldn't be the luxury of people who are either in positions of opportunity to make the time to do the lobbying or to do the research. It should be embedded in our system that people's views matter and that civic participation is easier. I agree, absolutely. Thanks a lot. Cheryl has a question. Just a reminder, folks, if you have questions, please do write them in the chat. We won't be taking questions on the Zoom call. It's just for the sake of time. Cheryl has said, I see local councils and state government rules obstructing opportunities for housing. We live on 200 acres in the Northern Rivers and would be open to allowing tiny homes on our property. The council will not allow it. I also know many other landholders would like to do the same. How do you see this changing? That one might be for you first, Anitra.
Yes, well, in our local area, we've got a very strong pressure group over tiny houses. So, for instance, they went out to council went out to consultation, I think it was about 18 months ago, about tiny housing and changing the law. I think they were quite surprised that in a shire in which there are just over 20,000 residents, they had 1,500 responses to that,
Wow.
overwhelmingly supporting tiny houses. So now we can have a tiny house on any block of land that has already got a house on it, but that's just one. That there are problems. For a vacant block of land, you can only have a tiny house if you're building and have a building application in for a house on that land. And it's either the owner's or the builder's tiny house, their residence. So obviously, we want tiny house eco-villages. We want more than one tiny house if that's an appropriate area for the tiny houses. So, and all I can see is that we all have to be pressuring our our local governments and the state governments on this. It's only by pressure that we can get change in these areas.
So perhaps for Cheryl and others in her community, finding out how to just create the messaging for their own local council and connecting with other folks to sort of share material with their council, saying, change the rules, let these things happen.
There are associations. There's a tiny house association. There are a couple of tiny house associations, and I think that Fred's tiny houses, they make tiny houses and they're in our area, that on their website, they've actually now got a connecting kind of spreadsheet come app that sort of puts people who are looking for tiny house places to put their tiny houses, or to become occupants of tiny houses, and people who've got room on their land for this. So if you get out there and have a look on the internet, it should be relatively easy to find groups that you can connect to, and they do have resources like there's a kind of database on the different councils and what their legislation is. However, it's a very fluid area. There are changes happening all the time in these different areas. And one of the ways that you can encourage your local council to do something is say, please do it as a pilot project. Don't do it under the current legislation that you've got. Do it as a pilot project. And then this can be, you can look good because you've led the area by, proving that this works or whatever. Yeah.
I would say it's also linked to agriculture, and that kind of one house, and you can't have a house on a rural block often unless the block is at least 100 acres or some kind of figure that they've come up with. And but I think that is also a conversation around a shift from monocultural industrial agriculture towards regenerative agriculture, which requires more people, and that farmers often they can't afford to pay people enough that they can live in the local town and then drive out to the farm that they need to work at, because the housing in the town is too much and the farms don't make enough money. So we need more people living on the farms and to do the work with appropriate amount for living and housing costs. But also it means that we can move towards more regenerative ecological approaches to food production as well, and away from these monocultures. And I would also say, from the perspective of tiny houses, that the current model of, often just one tiny house on a lot is still maintains that kind of landlord, potentially benevolent landlord, but landlord no less, that allows you to pop your tiny house on their land. And that we still need to move towards a structure where we have co-located houses, so we can create those social spaces in between, but also that there is more agency over the land to provide security into the long term.
Excellent, thank you. We're going to move on to community land trusts in just a moment. I'm just re-sharing. Mitzi has put a little note in there. Sorry, I saved it and then it went away. Melbourne's housing strategy statement, where the local governments are being told to increase their housing stock, is open for comment. Hurry, it closes tomorrow. And the link is there, Shape Our Victoria. So any of our Victorian friends, please do have a look at that. Let's talk for a moment about community land trusts. Firstly, could one of you define what they are and explain why people wave them about as a potential saviour to market-based escalation of pricing and such in the housing world?
I can just speak very briefly to that.
Please.
So community land trusts differ from other kinds of eco-collaborative housing, which are, typically cooperatives, but can actually be constituted under more of a strata title or owners corporation kind of legislation. all of these, the cooperatives, in as much as they're community controlled, can take land out of the market in a sense, because that community is deciding who comes and goes in terms of their communities. So the Community Land Trust isn't so different because it does that, as because generally the land itself is community owned, often by the state or a charitable organisation, so that the people only have to find money for developing their dwelling on the property. Yeah, and they're very popular, and they've gained quite a strong status in North America. But for whatever reason, very, very, very slow to get up and actually have examples in Australia. And I think it gets back to the Australian dream. Have you had your own land? It's just mine, this pocket handkerchief amount of land. This is all mine, and I can do whatever I like on it, you know. And people's trust and capacity to share is severely limited by these kinds of cultures that we have in Australia, which is very much about, you know, market bases and commodities and private ownership.
Thank you, Anitra. Although let's dig into that a little, because you would think in general terms that America would have just as much individualism and private property enthusiasm as Australia. Are there other reasons? I mean, I think the culture in Australia, and I'm a victim of it too, is the idea of, you know, sharing space and time with other people is a big effort because many of us aren't used to it much anymore. But are there other things that are stopping community land trusts from happening in Australia, more to do with the financial barriers, or do you really think it's just the culture?
Well, one of the things about America, the United States, is that it has more philanthropy. And Canada has also just, yeah, there might actually even be someone who's online who might be able to comment on that. But yeah, I don't know sufficiently enough as to why
that's fine, Anitra.
been taken up.
And I am I'm resharing. Someone has mentioned Grounded, which is an entity set up a couple of years ago, I believe, which is about community land trusts. But Elena, did you have anything you wanted to say or add about CLTs before we move on?
Yeah, I think they're a really good model, and we need to have a hell of a lot more of them. And Louise Crabtree-Hayes is doing some great work that will be hopefully pushing that space along. I think there's definitely appetite for it. I feel like the housing crisis has reached the point where there's a lot more people who are now seeing that they will never own their own house. So that Australian dream is dead, and now they're just looking at the next level around security and life, you know, lifestyle and a good life. So I feel like there is hope in that space because it has reached a crisis point, and that is maybe part of the problem. We have just enough social investment to keep the majority of us out of abject poverty, which is not the same as in America. They have, you know, increasing inequality, but that we do what they do, so we'll get there, and then we will see hopefully these other things flourishing. I would say, yeah, the philanthropy issue is part of it as well. I don't like philanthropy. We should just tax people, and then we should redistribute it for society and civilization, but also that there's that question around our capacity for sharing. I think people, they tend to consider, you know, the loss of something a lot more keenly than they do what people stand to gain. I can't remember what the scientific term for it is, but there are research papers on it. And so people fear that sense of, you know, losing their possession of that land, or their idea of what housing should and could be, and the potential benefits that you would gain from living in a more connected community and sharing resources and having a little bit less but having access to a lot more is really hard for people to understand and conceptualize and to kind of operationalize, because of the other barriers that we've already covered around finance and planning. So first you have to convince yourself that it's a good idea, and you have to be really convinced because you've got a big fight in front of you. And I mean, there are a lot of steps there to get projects going, and that's why they fail. Plus everybody is under enormous amount of financial pressure right now already, and they don't have that capacity to give. So we definitely, the other part of the problem is that we have this market state binary of consumerism and welfare, and we're dependent on the government to help, and other governments do help fund land and resources into co-ops and CLTs and other models for the middle of their society, rather than just the poorest of the poor. And we are in such a deficit of housing and social housing that all of the money that they have goes into that, as it should. Those people need housing, but it means that we don't have innovation in the middle. And so, and more people are going to fall off the bottom end than they are going to win lotto and start a property portfolio. So we need innovation in the middle.
Yeah, I was about to ask about that. This missing middle, I've heard other folks in the housing kind of crisis discussions having. And certainly from the outside looking in, someone who's not a housing expert, but who's been involved with the New Economy Network and looking at all the different solutions people are making, Australia seems to have this one size fits all for buying houses and land. And you're lucky enough to be able to get into an eco-village, and there's not a lot in the middle. You know, you've either got your own money and capacity to create an alternative society, or you're stuck in the little system that's been grinding on for 100 years. So I guess that space for alternatives, exactly what you've been talking about and what you're looking at with Eleanor Ostrom's amazing work, you know, spaces for commons. And I've always thought it would be great to have a few baby steps into shared spaces for people where they can have pets and they're allowed to eat meat. They're not perfect on the environmental front, but it would be 100 times better than the developments we're already seeing in my region, for example, to help people who are not used to sharing and not used to downscaling, to show them how wonderful it is to have shared gardens and other humans to talk to. But that's just my own curiosity. I think a lot of Aussies would be more inclined to look towards it if it didn't feel like either we do mainstream or we go the full, you know, hardcore environmental eco-village, which is wonderful in the way we have to go, but our culture, as we said before. Look, there are actually a lot of other questions, and thanks so much, everyone, for wonderful comments and questions and engaging with each other also. I might just finish with, it's sort of a comment on a couple of different things, but it might be a nice way for Eleanor and Anitra to wrap up. Jazz has made a statement and asked some questions. My background's in regenerative design and permaculture, and I'm most familiar with the Pacific Northwest bioregion in the US, where there's a large network of intentional living communities, tiny house villages, and permaculture movements. However, it's very fragmented due to legal constraints. Sorry, I've lost my spot. Albeit land use or shareholder primacy laws are also a problem. Are similar legal issues impeding a regenerative way forward in Australia? I think we've touched on that. Any strategies on the table about how to overcome those kinds of constraints? And then, isn't it true that land trusts are problematic because there are exit plans baked in to lose the lease within 100 years? So I thought maybe that, just reflecting back on Jazz's experience of fractured movements in her part of the world in the USA, and that longevity issue with community land trusts. If you could speak to that, we might be able to wrap up in the next 2 minutes and finish on time. Anitra?
I'll just say a couple of things. Okay, I'll just say one thing. I remember back in the 70s and 80s, and although a lot of young people think that the baby boomers had it all, it wasn't really the case. And in those days, and this was the case more or less worldwide, the whole idea about the right to housing was actually better established culturally than it is now. And we did a lot of squatting, and that's one of the reasons, like, the right to housing actually was kind of like seen as being communistic and everything else. But in Italy, for instance, there's still there's not just buildings, there are whole blocks that are occupied. And to be honest, I think that people who are really struggling with their housing, and if they're getting together with other people, I think that you have a right to occupy various areas. And I feel that would move things along a bit if people took it into their hands in that kind of way. So I'll leave you with that.
Oh, you're on
Michelle,
mute.
you're on mute.
No, just as well, actually, because I swore at myself for not being on. Anyway, yeah, excellent points, Anitra. And we often forget where we've come from and how things used to be. We're always so caught up in the now. We got the history of everything from citizen rights through to greenbelt movements to everything else needs to be remembered. And I think, yeah, the right to squat, housing as a human right, etc. So thank you. Elena, did you have any final comments?
I would say part of that is around doing it together. You know, doing those things alone is very challenging. And I think part of the problem and the reason why it doesn't happen to the same extent now as it did then is because it's just another one of those things that suffers from that individualization that has happened, and everyone feels that they are on their own when they really aren't. And there is a growing group of people who are obviously being affected and going to be affected. I'd say from the CLT space that it requires, I think it's important that those infrastructures, if they're created, use the model that I think the kind of traditional CLT uses, which is that they are 30% owned by, the government or philanthropy or whatever it might be, 30% by the people who live in them, and 30% by the neighborhood community. And that means that there isn't, it's not just government land that might decide to wind up the lease or do something else with it in the future. We need to have that cross-representation from many different cohorts. I would also say that we don't have the carbon budget to just keep building houses. There's reports in the UK and Europe that if they built the houses that are in their housing strategy, then that is their entire carbon budget. Right, there's no budget left for retrofitting, there's no budget left for anything else. So we're not going to build our way out of this. I think there were comments in the chat as well around, we have enough houses, we have more bedrooms than people. We just have people that don't sleep in those bedrooms. So we have a housing distribution problem. So we need to redistribute what we already have. We also have a plummeting birth rate, obviously, because people aren't feeling very confident in the world right now. And so we're not going to have the people to fill those houses in the future. So the economics of it don't stack up now, and they won't stack up in the future. So we need to have a totally different conversation about housing and access to housing, because we will kill our main house, which is the planet, if we don't solve our hyper local house.
Well, that is a fantastic way to end up, the idea that to look after the big picture house, our beautiful planet. And this brings us back to the bioregional approach. We really need local solutions to be pushing up through these legal and regulatory barriers together and finding ways through that. So before I thank Anitra and Elena, just point out to you that if you're not already a member of the New Economy Network Australia and the Housing Hub, which hasn't done a lot of stuff this year because we've all been unfortunately struggling with keeping ourselves alive and funding the work that we do. Isn't that fun? But please, I've put in the main email for Nina. This is something, the connections between the housing, human habitats and bioregionalism is something I think that many people are working on. And if we can bring more folks together, that would be grand. So shoot us an email, we'll add you to a list, and I'll work with Elena and Anitra and others to resurrect some of those activities we were doing. But we're over time by 4 minutes, but that shows what a rich and incredibly important conversation we're having today. So a huge thank you to Anitra and Elena, who are champions in their work. Look up their work, check out their organisations, and if you need to connect with folks, please send Nina an email, the New Economy Network Australia, and we'll see if we can help hook you up. Otherwise, back to plugging AELA, the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. Please tune in for our next bioregionalism seminar on the 19th of September. Look us up on earthlaws.org.au. And if you're interested in the big picture of challenging Western thinking, modernity, and racism so that we can build a much more beautiful, earth-centered, human-centered life, check out our decolonisation course in October. You'll also find that on our website. And thank you, everyone, for being part of these important conversations. Thanks for your time. And I'll let Anitra and Elena say farewell, and we'll wrap it up. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming along. Thanks for your questions. It was fun.
It was so important. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon. See you soon.